Once upon a time, I fell down an 80s music rabbit hole on YouTube, which is the best kind of rabbit hole to fall down. Trust me, I've done this more than once. But on this particular day, I was watching Tom Petty's Free Fallin', which awesome song and video if you didn't know. And because this is the crazy way that my brain works, I started wondering, well, whatever happened to the skateboarding girl? You know, the girl in the video who's skateboarding, the blonde girl at the end. And because the internet, I found a website dedicated to the girl in the video. That's what it's called, this particular segment. And it interviews girls who were in music videos. They were girls back in the 80s. And the guy who runs the site interviewed Devin Kidd, who's the skateboarding girl in the Free Fallin' video. And in the interview, she mentions that, quote, one of the girls in the video was murdered. People thought it was me. Okay, so of course I read this and my antenna goes up and I want to know the story. I have to know what happened, so I do some research. It turns out she wasn't exactly right. It's not that one of the other girls who appeared in the video was murdered, but the murderer, the guy who committed the murder that she's talking about, was in the video. I know, this sounds cuckoo clock, but stick with me, I promise. It's a whoa kind of a story. Hello and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love. And this week I'm putting a spotlight on the skateboarder who fell to earth. Growing up in the 80s was cray, and honestly, we had no idea how good we had it. MTV played actual music, everything was neon, we had Sweet Valley High books, Blockbuster nights were a thing, we didn't have to come home until the streetlights came on. I mean, we just had it so good. Something else that was huge with kids in the 80s was skateboarding, especially in California. Ironically, it would be a New Yorker who would become one of the superstars of the sport. When he was 3 years old, Brooklyn-born Mark Anthony Gator Rogowski moved to Escondido in San Diego County, which the Village Voice described as stuffed with, quote, surfers, malls, churches, and loads of disaffected middle-class youth. After a turn through Little League, Mark found himself drawn to skateboarding, and at 7 years old, he picked up his first skateboard. Instead of hanging out at the beach and surfing like every other kid in California, he was haunting skate parks. He spent so much time honing his craft that by the time he was 12, a local skate team had tapped him for a spot. A mere 2 years later, when he was 14, Mark went pro. He won his first big contest in 1982 with the Canadian Amateur Skateboarding Championships in Vancouver, and later won a national championship, which opened the door to endorsement deals. As a teenager, Mark was pulling in between $4,000 and $8,000 a month, hawking skateboarding gear and equipment. It wasn't long before Mark turned himself into a literal cash machine, his name stamped on everything from t-shirts, hats, stickers, posters, and skateboards, of course, with Mark earning a crazy amount of royalties in exchange for the use of his name. As in, he was 17 years old, earning $100,000 a year. As Entertainment Weekly put it, Mark became, quote, one of the breakout icons of the newly visible and commercialized skateboard scene. He was known as a master of the vert, or vertical style of skating, which is using skate ramps or, empty swimming pools. You're throwing your board up in the air, doing flips, handstands, and all kinds of other tricks, which would probably give me a headache. Mark even had his own signature move, the Gator, which involved flying through the air and turning and spinning, and now I actually do have a headache. Mark was considered to be one of the prestige skaters of the day, a member of a highly exclusive circle of athletes who elevated the sport to frenzied devotion and massive, rabid crowds. Tony Hawk, Lance Mountain, Christian Hosoi, and Steve Caballero were his peers. He hobnobbed with downtown Julie Brown on Club MTV, was Christian Slater's stunt double in the movie Gleaming the Cube. He scored a few dates with actress Patricia Arquette, and Thrasher magazine breathlessly covered his every move every single month. With his dark hair and green eyes, he was considered a photogenic, charismatic, and creative showman, a charming, badass rebel who dazzled crowds and, above all, sold a lot of friggin' skateboards. Mark was the king of the skateboarding world. All he needed was a queen. In 1987, 21-year-old Mark met 15-year-old Arizona native blonde, blue-eyed Brandy McLean at a skate show in Scottsdale. She was there with her best friend, aspiring model Jessica Bergsten, who was also blonde and blue-eyed. The trio hung out all weekend, but Brandy turned out to be more than one of Mark's skater groupies. He dug her, and it wasn't long before Mark and Brandy were an inseparable item, with Mark flying Brandy to San Diego on a regular basis. As Brandy told the Village Voice, quote, "We would get high every night. We wouldn't do coke every night, but we'd do bong hits. We'd go to the sandbar at the end of his street. Then we'd hang out in his jacuzzi, get drunk off our asses, and go in and have wild sex all night." When Mark and Brandy weren't playing hard, they were working hard, appearing in advertisements and promotional videos for popular skateboarding brand Vision, and as I mentioned earlier, the couple even popped up in the music video for Tom Petty's Free Fallin', which features that gravity-defying vert style of skating, and it's just so California in the 80s, the video, seriously. Within a couple of years of meeting, Brandy had permanently moved into Mark's house, perched among the lush avocado groves of Fallbrook in northern San Diego County. She lost touch with Jessica, becoming totally consumed with her relationship with Mark and the rock and roll world of skateboarding. Mark and Brandy lived like they had a money tree out back, which they kind of did, flying all over the world for Mark's skating competitions. Despite Mark lavishing money and gifts on Brandy, including 2 cars, his brother Matt told the Village Voice about the pair, quote, "When they were together, they were absolutely in love, and you could see it." Mark's got the world on a string. He's got the girl, he's got the money, he's got the fame. He's got it all. As Perry Gladstone, who owned Fish Lips Skateboards, told Village Voice, quote, "You've got to understand, top skaters were like rock stars, traveling all over the world, living the life. And Gator was the wildest of them all." So if you think it's all about to crash and burn, yeah, ding, 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 winner, winner, chicken dinner, that's exactly what is about to happen. As the 80s started to come to a close, the flashy style of vert skating, the one Mark had built his name and fortune on, was starting to wane, slowly being replaced by the grittier street skating style, which shied away from the skate parks and literally took it to the streets, using curbs, benches, ledges, and garbage cans as props. There were no helmets, no knee pads, no gloves. It was just balls to the wall, hardcore, in the trenches skating. Mark struggled to adapt his flashy skateboarding style of skating to this rougher street skating style. He worried about how to stay on top and keep from becoming passé. It wasn't looking good though, because the skate parks where he'd become a legend were closing, and the companies that had been sponsoring him and selling all of this merchandise with his name on it were starting to go under. Then, in 1989, during a trip to West Germany for a skating competition, while partying one night, Mark got wasted, which was like a day ending in Y. And what happened next, depending on who you asked, he either leapt out of a second-story window thinking he could fly, or was trying to climb back into his hotel room via a terrace and fell. Whatever the real story is, he landed on a wrought iron fence and impaled his face, his hand, and his neck in the process. Ouch. Unbelievably, he survived and had to endure months of surgeries after the fact in an attempt to put himself back together, quite literally. So this is not only for benefit of trying to rescue his career, not only because of skating, but because he also did a lot of modeling, so his face was just as important as his body. The accident would mark a serious turning point for him. In other words, it would change everything. By the time Mark was released from the hospital, he actually looked like the Mark his friends knew. But make no mistake about it, dude was different. For starters, he seemed to undergo a religious conversion. As the Village Voice noted, Gator declared, quote, "Jesus Christ spoke to me through that accident. I was a blind dude, but now I can see." He went all out, draping his boards with religious symbols, preaching about Jesus, quoting the Bible. Whit Rowlett, owner of Witt's Carlsbad Pipelines, a surf shop in Carlsbad, told the Village Voice, quote, "Mark was just a fanatic. Everything he said was Jesus this, the Bible that. He was way into it." However, not everybody was buying this religious conversion, chalking it up to Gator being Gator. As Perry Gladstone told the Village Voice, quote, "Yeah, he was fanatic, but that's just it. He was fanatic about everything. That was just Gator." One person who definitely didn't have time for Mark supposedly having found Jesus was Brandy. Mark took her to church a handful of times, but Brandy had no interest in being converted. She wanted to keep the status quo of partying, drinking, and getting it on. Mark, however, thought they were sinners because they were having sex outside of marriage. Except Brandy wasn't buying any of it. As she told the Village Voice, quote, "We literally had sex 5 times a day. We were so in love. Then he started saying, we can't have sex anymore unless we get married." And I'm like, wait a minute. We've been going out for 4 years, having mad sex for 4 years, and we can't have sex anymore? So, while Mark is claiming to have seen the light, there is a darkness festering inside of him, one that he frequently unleashed on Brandy. As she shared with the Investigation Discovery TV show Shattered, Mark had a ferocious temper, and that he had his skating persona and then his true self, which she says was not so pretty and not so charming. She says that he would go off the rails about the smallest of things and was extremely possessive of her, that he wanted to keep her locked in that ivory tower out there in the middle of nowhere Fallbrook, where no one could get to her. Their time together was tempestuous, marked by frequent breakups and makeups. Things came to a head one day following a petty argument that ended with a terrified Brandy being locked in a closet. Coupled with Mark's religious zealotry, it was all too much for Brandy, who moved out and went to live with her parents who had just moved to San Diego. By all accounts, Mark was devastated when Brandy left, and he didn't handle it well. The salt in the wound stung even more when he found out she had a new guy, a surfer of all things. He went ballistic and started leaving Brandy some straight-up cuckoo clock messages on her answering machine, saying things like, quote, "You bitch, you see you next Tuesday. You're gonna fry in hell from your toes." That's a new one. I've never heard that particular expression before. But Mark escalated his fury by breaking into Brandy's house and stealing back everything he'd ever given her, including one of the cars he'd gifted to her. Clothes, jewelry, pictures cut out of frames, anything and everything. Police compared it to the kind of teenage stunt you pull when you break up with someone and you're so incensed, you just want everything back. Doesn't matter if it's a matchbook from the restaurant where you had your first date. You want that shiz back because you don't want them to have it. A few weeks later, police informed Brandy that her possessions had been found, torched in the desert. In spite of all the turmoil, Brandy held out a slender thread of hope that they might be able to work things out, that they might fulfill their dream of settling down and having a family. She even went so far as to make a dinner date with Mark as the first step towards reconciliation. However, still stinging from Brandy hanging out with this hot surfer guy, Mark picks a fight with her before they leave the house. According to what Brandy told the Village Voice, that's when things took an exceedingly dark turn, far worse than anything Mark had shown her before. Brandy said that, quote, "Mark was furious. He was driving out in the middle of this nowhere road where my parents live when he turned to me with this really scary, serious look in his eye. His voice got all deep and he sounded like the devil. He says, 'You know what? I should take you out to the desert right now. I should drive you out in the middle of the night and beat the shit out of you and leave you there. And I would get away with it because everybody would know that you deserved it.'" Holy hell, can you imagine somebody saying that to you? Brandy, of course, freaked out and started crying, begging Mark to take her home, telling him that her mother knew she was with him and where they were going. Mark gave in and took Brandy home. Afterward, Brandy was spooked enough to get the hell out of Dodge and fled to New York, only telling her family where she was. March 20th, 1991. Jessica Bergsten, Brandy's girlfriend from Tucson, has just moved to San Diego. Jessica, an aspiring model, was tall and blonde, just like Brandy. Friends told the Village Voice Jessica was, quote, tough, savvy, and adventurous. Brandy remembered her as a, quote, incredibly intelligent, free-spirited girl who wanted to have fun. She and Brandy have lost touch, and she really hasn't made any friends since making the move. The only person Jessica knows in San Diego is Mark. Jessica dials his number and asks him to show her around. Jessica has no idea that Brandy has escaped to New York in order to get away from Mark. She has no idea that the cool, fun-loving skater dude she'd met at that skating show in Tucson all those years ago had threatened to beat Brandy to death. All Jessica knows is that she's in a new city, she doesn't really know anyone, and she figures, hey, why not call Mark? They'd hang out, they'd have fun, see some sights. It would be a great day. Jessica and Mark meet up for lunch at an Italian restaurant in La Jolla before heading back to his condo to watch some movies and have a few glasses of wine. Later that night, Mark was supposed to take Jessica home when he says he's got to get something out of his car first. Jessica, meanwhile, is in the living room, standing in front of his mantel, studying one of his favorite pictures of himself. He's skydiving, facing the camera and screaming. She's so engrossed in the photo, she doesn't hear him sneak up behind her. He slams one of those club steering wheel locks into Jessica's head, landing 3 blows. Jessica collapses, blood pouring from the wound, soaking the carpet like water. He screams Bible verses at her before slapping handcuffs on her wrists and carrying her upstairs. He handcuffs her to the bed, then takes a pair of scissors and cuts her clothes. And for the next 3 agonizing hours, he repeatedly rapes her. A still conscious Jessica begs for him to stop and screams for help. Mark's response is to go into his closet for a surfboard bag and stuff her inside in an attempt to muffle her screams. Except her screams don't stop. She's pleading with him, kicking, struggling. She can't breathe. Terrified that his neighbors will hear her, Mark's response this time is to place his hand over her mouth and suffocate her to death. Jessica Bergsten was 22 years old. Mark stripped the sheets soaked in Jessica's blood from his bed and flipped over the mattress to hide the evidence of his brutality. He loaded Jessica's body, along with the surfboard bag, her slashed clothing, the club, and the handcuffs, into his trunk and drove 2 hours until he reached the desert. He stopped in Shell Canyon, dug a shallow grave, and dumped Jessica inside. On his way back home, he tossed her bloody clothes, the bloody sheets from his bed, and the murder weapon out the window. His last act was to rent a carpet steamer to sop up every drop of blood from the carpet where a bleeding, incapacitated Jessica had collapsed hours earlier. Soon, Jessica's father, Stephen, worried when he hadn't heard from his daughter and dissatisfied with the local police response to his concern, flew to San Diego to look for her. He showered San Diego County with missing persons flyers featuring Jessica. And crazily enough, he even crossed paths with Mark, who, according to the Village Voice, shook Stephen's hand and said he had no idea where Jessica was. 2 months pass with no sign of her. Finally, it would be one of those missing persons flyers that would spur Mark to confess. There was one posted in the window of a local 7-Eleven that he frequented, and it began to gnaw at his conscience, seeing Jessica's picture day after day, knowing what he'd done. And he couldn't take it. As the Village Voice reported one night, following a Bible study at a friend's house, he blurted out that he'd killed the girl on the poster. Mark's friend drove him to the police station, where he turned himself in. At that time, police didn't realize that a murder had even been committed. Although Jessica's body had actually been discovered by some campers on April the 10th, it couldn't be identified because it was so badly decomposed. Mark did eventually lead cops to the burial site where they collected further evidence. And so even though Mark had confessed to murdering Jessica, even showing police where he buried her, he pleaded not guilty. Never mind the blood stains under the carpet, never mind that he'd rented the carpet cleaner, which he still had the receipts for, never mind that he'd showed the cops where he buried the body. He said, you know what? No, I'm not guilty. Mark was charged with special circumstances because he raped Jessica as he was murdering her. Under California law, that meant he could get the death penalty or life without parole. His public defender, in the grand, disgusting tradition of victim blaming, told the media Jessica was, quote, a slut, that she had engaged in S&M not only with the entire University of Arizona basketball team, but with some professional athletes as well. Oh, prick. This attorney also tried to get Mark's confession thrown out because the friend he'd confided in, the one who drove him to the police station, Mark considered him to be a minister, even though he wasn't ordained as one. The friend contends that Mark knew he wasn't ordained and therefore knew what would happen when he confessed to him. Eventually, in order to avoid the death penalty or life without parole, Mark did plead guilty to first-degree rape and murder. In a 4-page statement he submitted as part of his plea, Mark blamed his actions on premarital sex, porn, jealousy, and disobeying the Bible. During his sentencing, Mark addressed Jessica's family and asked their forgiveness, saying, quote, God has changed me, and it was no typical jailhouse conversion. I sincerely hope that they can accept my apology for my carelessness. Understandably, Jessica's father went berserk at Mark terming his brutal act as carelessness, shouting that Mark was, quote, evil incarnate, and begged the judge not to fall for what he saw as a bogus religious conversion. In the end, Superior Court Judge Thomas J. Whalen sentenced Mark to 31 years, 6 years for raping Jessica, and 25 years to life for her murder. For years, Mark remained in total denial about what he had done to Jessica, blaming what he did on sex, on porn, even going so far as to say that smashing the club over her head was S&M, telling the Village Voice, quote, the fact is that it wasn't rape. It was more like an involuntary manslaughter. If it wasn't for my submission to her wiles and the temptation of having sex with her. Wow. He goes on to say that, quote, that night, I didn't realize what kind of a purring feline she was. It's really hard for me to say these things about Jessica. We lost her, and I don't feel good about that. I just want to make it known that I was led into a sexual situation that I didn't want to have anything to do with. I was scared I'd be discovered with this wayward woman. And it gets better. Finally, he absolved himself of murder by declaring, quote, she must have suffocated or had a seizure or a stroke or something. The next thing I knew, I looked down and she's not breathing and not moving. Wow. Make that make sense. So the truth is, the real target of Mark's homicidal fantasies was Brandy. Remember that he told her he wanted to drive her to the desert and beat her to death. And he almost did. As Brandy said and shattered, quote, everyone knows it was supposed to be me. As Mark told police, quote, everything that I hated about Brandy, I hated about Jessica. She was of the same mold that Brandy was made of. He also said that he blamed Jessica for his breakup with Brandy, which is absurd since Jessica had no clue that they'd even broken up. Brandy herself said she and Jessica had kind of lost touch. Regardless, Mark viewed Jessica as a negative influence on Brandy. As Brandy said in the documentary Stoked, The Rise and Fall of Gator, Mark didn't want Brandy to be friends with Jessica. In his statement to police, Mark revealed that about a week before he murdered Jessica, he went to Brandy's house and knocked on the door. And this wasn't for a friendly visit. He says that his intention that day was that he was going to kill Brandy, that he was going to make good on his previous threat of taking her to the desert, assaulting her, and leaving her to die. Except nobody was home. In Mark's warped and twisted logic, Jessica and Brandy were one and the same. Same blonde hair, same blue eyes, same personality, same person. He wanted revenge on Brandy, wanted to spew all of his rage onto her. And if he couldn't murder Brandy, he'd murder Jessica. Mark has been denied parole on multiple occasions over the years. However, at the end of 2019, the California Parole Board recommended parole. However, when it came before California Governor Gavin Newsom, he said, "Nope, forget it," stating in his review, quote, "Mr. Rogowski appears to still only have a superficial understanding of what triggered him to inflict prolonged sexual violence on his victim and then kill her." Further saying Mark, quote, "poses an unreasonable danger to society if released from prison at this time." Mark Rogowski will next be eligible for parole in March of 2023. Through the years, there's been a lot of confusion about what actually happened. As I mentioned, Devin Kidd, who starred in the Free Fallin' video alongside Brandy and Mark, shared that people thought she was the one who was murdered, and as I said, she thought it was Brandy because Brandy was in the video. Actress Patricia Arquette, who I mentioned, went out on a few dates with Mark, one of which she later said was one of her worst dates ever because of how aggressive he was during a makeout session, stated that, quote, "years later he killed his girlfriend," which obviously wasn't true either because Jessica and Mark weren't even friends, much less boyfriend and girlfriend. They were barely acquaintances. So like I said, a lot of confusion, a lot of misunderstanding around what happened. But here's the cold, hard truth. Mark Anthony Gator Rogowski raped and murdered Jessica Bergsten before burying her body in a shallow grave in the desert. He did it not because of Brandy, not because Jessica lured him into some S&M fueled afternoon. He did it because he's a murderer. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, and show your love for The Dark Side by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. And while you're there, you can also find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus episodes and other fun stuff. Learn more about my suspense novels about The Dark Side of Love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.